I'm Paul Stephan. I'm a bonsai enthusiast or addict, however you want to classify it. I study plants. I worked in the nursery industry for a little over 3.5 years now. Usually I specialize in trees, big trees. And I recently got a plant science degree from Cal Poly Pomona. So I'm fairly invested into the plant world. And I also enjoy ceramics. I dabbled a little in high school, and I have an interest now in antiques, especially Japanese and Chinese. And I also like the history behind all these antiques, and I enjoy translating and getting friends helping me do so, these books, and then sharing that information. I think it's really valuable to people in the US who can't access all this information. And I do my best to make it accurate and use references so people could then trace that back. I also have my own business. It's called KI Bonsai Art. I just sell trees and pots and bonsai related items. But today we were just going to be focusing on pre-World War II bonsai pot history and just kind of skimming the surface and dabbling in that world to get an introduction to that. I look forward to seeing you soon. Hello everyone, so today we're going to be talking about pre-World War II bonsai pottery specific to China and Japan. And let's get into it. So before we begin, I'm an avid researcher, I'm not a professional. I'm very interested in getting things factual and doing my best to have references, but just remember that I'm not really a professional here. Now, Christina Kaneshige helped me translate a lot of the books that I use and a lot of the Japanese references, so that's been really key. She's a Japanese person from Japan, and many of the photos I'm using aren't all mine. I tried to use as many as possible for my own camera, but some are going to be coming from Kobayashi's book or from the Yorazen website, which is a Shohin bonsai pot nursery in Japan that sells and specializes in Chinese antiques and Japanese antiques. I will let you know when I'm using those photos. If there are any discrepancies, please feel free to email me. I'm always trying to better my information and make sure what I'm saying is true. Thank you. So we are going to start first in ancient China. The history of ceramic ware is deep in China, going back thousands and thousands of years. They even found ceramic ware in the Yangtze province dating back to 7000 BC. High fire was common in the Shang dynasty in around 1600 BC. And 2,000 years later, high-fired glazes started in Japan and Korea. So that's how far back the Chinese ceramic ware is. The history is deep, and the North and the South have very different cultures when it comes to ceramics and what they make. So the main dynasties of note and eras that we're going to be talking about is going to be the Ming Dynasty, which is late 14th century to the 17th century. The Qing Dynasty, which is going to be mid-1600s to the early 1900s. And then after that is going to be the Chinese Revolution, where the nationalists and the socialists kind of were feuding with each other at the tail end collapse of the Qing Dynasty. Now, a brief history of that time period. So the Qing Dynasty, which really went back for a long period of time and was thriving until the imperials came in early 1800s to mid 1800s. You had the British who were forcing the selling of drugs like opium because they needed to make money, especially after losing their colonies in the Americas. And that a large portion of the Chinese population was actually addicted to opium, and the government tried to stop that, and it didn't really work, and it caused an eventual collapse in the Qing Dynasty. and which was quite sad, and there's actually still resentment for that today. And so those are the two dynasties we're really going to be focusing on, though: Ming, Qing, and the Revolutionary period, 1911 onward. So the Chinese pottery classification that the Japanese use is we have Kowatari, we have Kowatari, Nakawatari, Shinto, Shinshinto. Now these are all based on when the bonsai pots were imported to Japan. So it's not the exact date when they were created. It's pretty well correlated, but it's more so when it was imported from China. Kowatari would be imports in the early Meiji era and earlier. And Nakawatari would be later Meiji era to the Taisho. Shinto is going to be around 1923 to 1941. Shinshinto is going to be a brief period after the mid-1970s. So the Nakawatari, which means the middle crossing, these pots are going to be what we most commonly see from Japan, or are most accessible to normal people. And these commonly came from around 1885 to 1926, so they're around 100 years old, which is kind of the bare minimum for an antique. And these are a bit more common. They're not as rare as you would think. And the most desirable, though, are going to be the Kowatari, which is the old crossing. So these are going to be imports, usually before 1868. These can be very expensive. And the patina on these, it could be hundreds of years. It could be they could be very old. But generally, the Chinese, especially with the booming economy of China, they're starting to buy out most of these antiques, which is making them more and more difficult to find. And these are going to be a little bit more difficult for someone to buy if you're not willing to spend a lot of money. But they are quite beautiful. So we're actually looking at a Kinyo glazed pot here. So now kiln chops. Kiln chops identify artists or kilns of origin. Now, they don't always accurately determine when the pot was made or the value of the pot. So keep that in mind. The estimated value of a pot is usually going to come down to the pot itself and the quality of the pot itself. And that is much more telling than just the lack or presence of a kiln chop. Now, it's a very useful tool, especially for someone who's not a professional, but it's best to consult with a Japanese professional because they deal with hundreds of antiques. They go to auctions yearly, and someone in the US will just never have that level of experience. So if you really need help with that kind of stuff, it's best to seek out a Japanese professional. Clay and glaze types. So there's immense variability in the types of clays used and the glazes used. And we're going to go through a few of them so we can better classify and understand the different types of antiques. And this adds to collectability as well. Some people like certain types of clays and styles and glazes. It really adds in another factor into the antique world. So one of the first classifications of the antique Chinese, probably one of the most common, is the shide, or it's the purple clay. This is a picture from Kobayashi's book, by the way. And a lot of these come from the Yixing region during the Qing dynasty. So, and this is the period of that dynasty. This pot looks like it's a little bit deeper, probably for a Satsuki, something that needs a little bit more water retention. And that is an antique, Chinese antique. Here's another. And here's another, quite beautifully made, old, nice patina. Now we have shude, which is a vermilion clay. And these were also made a lot of pots are going to be made in the Yixing area of China. And the production would be Qing as far back to the Ming dynasty. Here you see a bonsai pot with actually a poem written on it in Chinese. I don't know what it says, but I'm sure it's beautiful, just like the pot. Here's a beautifully made pot with that vermilion clay. You could see all the different kind of crevices and divots in the pot, which is extraordinarily difficult to make. So we have koude, which is red clay. This is also usually made in Yixing. Pretty rare type of clay. Usually the most skilled artisans would be making or using this type of clay, and it's highly sought after in Japan. Here's another example of that red clay. So here we have a tofukuji, or the peach blossom clay. Pretty rare. Generally these are kowatari, so these are going to be pre-Meiji mostly. And this is a museum level piece from Kobayashi's book, beautifully carved, nice cloud feet, and that really characteristic clay. So now we have ude, which is also highly desirable type of clay. It's like a darkish brown kind of clay. Some of the best are going to be also kowatari, made 200 to 350 years ago. Here's another example. Beautiful carvings, nice thick cloud feet. Looks like there's some repairs on it. This is also from Kobayashi's book. He has a beautiful collection. Now we have kokude, which is a black clay. And this was done by kind of adding different substances to the clay itself and adjusting for the firing condition, which causes charcoal, maybe some ash, to be absorbed into the clay and make it dark. And these are pretty rare antiques. You could see the Shikoto shape with the cloud feet. Here's another example. You could even see the underlying clay. So very nice look to it. And beautiful carvings on there, or however they made that. So now there's hakude, which is a white clay, another uncommon clay from the Yixing region. Here's the oval pot. Now we're going to move on to styles of pots. We have the Nanban style, which is from the southern Asia. The Tang. So what you see highlighted right now is the Tang Empire region. It would be south of this region, and so please use this as a reference. These pots are very gritty, and they're usually fairly heavy, shallow, and they were used for often literati trees that kind of have these elegant thin trunks on them. Here's an example with the little drum bits. So now we have a type of glaze, the Kinyu, the sky blue glaze. This is also commonly seen glaze. Not uncommon to find these amongst the antique Chinese. Here's a smaller one. This would be a mame. And a slightly larger one. A really beautiful color. It matches quite nicely with a flowering tree, especially like a satsuki or a apple, maybe crab apple. So now we have Ryo Kinyu, which is a robin's egg glaze. If you're familiar with Chinese antiques in general, you probably have seen this sort of glaze. There's that speckled, dotted pattern, and it's quite mesmerizing. These have gone back all the way to the Yongzheng period, to the Qing dynasty. Now we have the shirakochi, or the white cochin. And these generally came from southern China, also Yixing. And you find these in the Ming and Qing. Now these are quite common also amongst the antique Chinese. They liked using this cream-colored glaze, and it conveniently patinaed quite well since then. So they really kind of take on their own personality. This is a very old shirakochi, and here are some other examples. They are also, many of them are earthenware, so they're not high fired. They're fired at a lower temperature. And Here's another example. As you can see, they patina very nicely. Now we have okochi, which is going to be green, a green colored cochin. Also yixing, similar to the same regions as the white cochin, and also created in the Ming and Qing. We also have kikochi, which is going to be a yellow. You'd find these in the same regions as you would find the shirokochi and okochi. Now we have Nanjing, which is a region not very far from the Yixing area, and this would be in the Yangtze province. So circled above, at the very top of that map piece, you see the Nanjing region where they would be exporting out a lot of porcelain ware in particular. And this was kind of the distribution area. And for hundreds of years, all the way back to the Song Dynasty, it was considered a white gold because it was such a useful thing for the Chinese to trade. It is still today an epicenter for artists in China. Now, a lot of the wares that were produced and exported, or that were exported in the Nanjing area, were produced actually in the Jingdezhen area in the south. So you could see that circled. And that is also another prominent area for artists. So here's a porcelain piece from the Nanjing region, an antique, and plenty of patina on it, but it is a porcelain piece. Here's another with a yellow glaze and the very cool patterns on the side of the pot. Here's another. Now we have the Namakoyu, which is known as the sea cucumber glaze. It's a fairly common glaze amongst the antiques, but there are lots of variation, and it's easy to match with a flowering or deciduous tree. We also have the sobayu, which is a buckwheat glaze. Iron is crystallized in the kiln with this glaze, and it goes back from the Yongzhen to the Qilang period during the Qing dynasty. Now we have the Cantonese pots. So these are going to be Cantonese or Guangdong. This is going to be southern China. These are often copper-based glazes. They range from green to blue to rudi, which would be like a indigo or cobalt. And the inspiration actually from how they made these glazes goes all the way back to the Middle East when they used to trade. And in the Middle East, they had a very similar sort of glaze that they didn't copy, but they made their own style upon that. So the history of this glaze goes very, very far back. And many modern day artists have tried to copy this glaze and make a better version of it, like Tofukuji. We will go over that artist later. So here's a rudi glaze. It's kind of that dark indigo-ish / cobalt color. Now we have celadon porcelain, which is one of the most ancient forms of the Chinese porcelain ware. And it was an evolutionary step before modern day just porcelain ware. And it originates all the way back to 1600 BC. Now, the modern porcelain ware that we see today was invented around 100 BC. Now, lastly, we're almost there, guys, the royal kilns. So the royalty in China, they would often sponsor kilns to create beautiful works of art. And these are usually museum pieces and highly sought after. And there's several different royal kilns throughout China that made quite spectacular works of art. Kind of like in the Renaissance, how the Medicis were sponsoring the works of all these different artists. The Chinese royalty were doing the same for many different types of ceramic ware for hundreds of years. So now we're moving on. We're transitioning from Chinese antiques to the Japanese wares before World War II. And we're first going to mention the inspiration that many Japanese artists and kilns had. China had immense influence on Japan. The feet, the shapes, the glazes. You see a lot of that kind of transition over into Japan. Tofukuji, you see a lot of his pots have that bluish green glaze, which is definitely Cantonese influence. He must have seen some pots that kind of awestruck him, and he must have thought, I could do this, and I could do it probably better. So he did, and now he's famous for his glazes. He also made nanban, and many other artists made nanban pots, which are those shallow, wide pots. The Shikoto shape is another style. So this is actually the Shikoto shape. This is a highly desirable type of pot shape that was made from this famous kiln. And today you see the shape pop up everywhere. If you look at all the tokoname pieces, it's quite ubiquitous now. So here's Iko, who is a modern day potter from the Tokoname region. And you could see a very similar look from this antique shape to his modern day shape. And so now you know a lot of these shapes are just coming from old antique Chinese designs, which is quite interesting to think about. So now we're going to briefly go over the Japanese pottery and the regions. So there's a lot of different regions where there's no artist per se, but it just came from that area. So there's Kyoyaki, which would be Kyoto-based wares. There's Akahara, there's Satsuma, Imari, etc. I'm not going to go into all those because there's too many. I'm just going to go over one. This tree you actually see in a Kyoyaki, which would be, yaki means ware, so a piece from the Kyoto region. This would actually be an antique. So Akahara yaki, this would be pottery that was fired in the Yamato or Gojo village in Nara City. It was said to be derived, the clay, from Mount Gojo, which is formerly known as Mount Akahara, and it was found by a lord of the Koriyama Castle during the late 1500s to early 1600s. So history goes quite far back. Here's a better shot of that Akahara piece. So now we have the Japanese artist highlights, especially these are pre-World War II. I'm not doing much of I'm not doing any. Some of these artists made works after World War II, but I'm going to be focusing on their pre-war works. So Takamoto, Ichikawa, Eiso Wakamatsu, Hankoso, Ichiyo, Tofukuji, Kozon. These are only a handful of the many hundreds of artists. So just keep that in mind. These are the popular names of these pre-World War II artists. So Takamoto, he goes way far back, so late 1800s. He's one of my favorite artists. He was born in an era in 1848, which was right before Admiral Perry, which was a US admiral, came to Japan and basically said, you're going to open up and you're going to trade with us. We're not really giving you an option. And after 220 years of isolation, they had to open up by force. And this really caused a lot of upheaval because the people didn't want foreign influence coming in. And so samurai and people from the Satsuma and Choshu regions rebelled. And they failed at first, but then they actually took up modern day arms like pistols and rifles. And they succeeded in overthrowing the shogun. So this insurgency they succeeded. And the new capital, instead of Kyoto, became Tokyo. And the boy king became Emperor Meiji. And this is the start of the Meiji era. So the great change happened in this era. The samurai, which Takamoto was a part of the samurai class since his father was, they drafted a new government. The samurai elites did. And they decided the only way to bring order to the country was to modernize. And to do so, they needed to eliminate the caste system. So they couldn't have a samurai class and the peasant class and accept all these different classes. So the samurai actually ended up destroying their own class. And of course, some samurai from the south did not want this. So there was another insurgency. And the Satsuma, they tried to fight the new government that was trying to ratify. and the modernized army of Japan crushed them, and this was the end of the samurai culture forever, really. So Takamoto was really one of the last of the samurai, which is cool. And Takamoto, so generally the samurai class people were quite wealthy, but after this restoration, the Meiji Restoration, he became just like everyone else. So he actually became kind of poor and impoverished and unemployed because he was no longer had employment in his whatever the samurai would be doing. And so he took up ceramics, and he met up with a famous artist, Ryosai, and he kind of encouraged and collaborated. And they really they started their own kiln and started making the Takamoto Yaki, which is a Takamoto style ware. And they embraced the slogan, Japanese spirit, Western technology. So they used a lot of Western techniques, but they had that Japanese style. And some of these techniques would be molds. So Takamoto did utilize a lot of molds and different firing techniques. So he was able to actually produce quite a bit of wares by doing this. And they became somewhat famous and recognized for their works in Japan in the late 1800s. So Takamoto's works are mainly semi-porcelain, celadon, soba, kochin. He also made some hexagonal pieces, and he had quite a variety. He had sponsors too. Count Matsudaira, who was a philanthropic man, loved his works, bought a lot of his small pots. He has his own book now on all these pots he collected. And through people like this aristocrat, he was able to show off his trees in these beautiful little pots, and people became fascinated with it. And it actually kind of started the beginning of Mame/Shohin bonsai. And so really in tandem, Takamoto and Count Matsudaira helped catalyze the start of something quite beautiful. Here are some examples of some Takamoto pots. Here's a green glaze. There's the red and a few different colors. They're quite beautiful, very old, a lot of very small pots. He has these characteristic little round feet, and you'll actually see a later artist, Ichikawa, use the same thing. I'll kind of explain why later, but these are very tiny. Here's another extremely small pot. Same sort of feet, different clay. So Ichikawa Taishu, he was born in Takasaki, 1897, and in his his late 20s, he started making bonsai pottery in Tokyo, actually very close to where Takamoto's family lived. Now Takamoto is dead during this period of time, but it's said he may have gotten a hold of some of the molds Takamoto used, and this is why we see a lot of similar small pots that Ichikawa made. I'll go over some comparisons in a bit. And Ichikawa made most of his pots in like 1930s-ish. And his glaze work is quite spectacular. He made some red, mixed colored glazes. So this is like green and red bean. And these are all wood-fired, so this is quite difficult to do. Here's another. This is from Your Zen's website. This is a personal, small one. And if you see here, those little ball feet, that's very similar to Takamoto's, as you can see. So there's speculation that he talked and collaborated with the family years after Takamoto's death. So I like his pots a lot. Asa Wakamatsu is another artist in Kyoto, the Kyoto region. And he was near the Wakamatsu Elementary, which is where he kind of got his name, his artist name. His bonsai pots were made, they think, in the early Showa era, so it's pre-war, a lot of them. And he specialized in block carving, like little pots, so they're very blocky. They have a very characteristic shape, and wood-fired. And he had a very close relationship with Kawai Sutazo, who was the owner of Kozon in Kyoto. So here are some examples, beautiful blue, and they call this like a candy glaze. Here's a top view of a different pot, very blocky. Sometimes there's a little bit of wonk because of how he block carved. You could also see little, near the drainage holes, you could kind of see that rust stain because they probably used to use metal mesh rather than plastic like we use, so it's kind of interesting. Here's a little cube with a rudi glaze. This is probably has cobalt in it. So Hainkoso, or Kawai Tsutazo, who built a kiln around 1938 near the Higashi Hongwanji Temple in Kyoto. He was kind of he orchestrated and got together a bunch of artists around this kiln to develop and research small bonsai pots. Eiso Wakamatsu and Kenjiro Nagata and plenty of other artists were involved in this group. And they made some really nice small pots. Here's an example of one from this kiln. We also have, now moving on, Ichiyo. His real name is Kamiya Kochi. He was born 1902, died in 1985. He worked with pottery since a young age, and at 24 he made his own business. He has pre- and post-war works, so before the war, those are his most desirable works. And he kind of struggled, but he made it through that period. And then with the set of World War II, he had to kind of change his whole life and his profession. And it wasn't until after the war that he got back into pottery. But those are not considered as valuable as his pre-war works. And he kind of pushed forward innovation. He didn't believe that what he considered a Japanese art form should have Chinese pots. He thought that the pots should be Japanese made. So that's why he really pushed for the development of the Japanese pots. So here's an example of one with a nice greenish blue glaze. Here's another non-bond style with the cream glaze. So now we have the great high-end Tofukuji. I'm sure you've heard of this artist before. And if you haven't, he's a very famous artist. He was born in 1890. His real name's Kisaburo Mizuno. And he broke away from his family's traditional business to make bonsai pots because that was his love. Now, bonsai was not as popular during this time, so this was kind of a reckless move. And it was really just out of passion because there wasn't really a market at this time for bonsai pots. And because of this, he was quite poor. And he lived in poverty for most of his life. He had to share kilns, and he made do though, and he made some spectacular pots. Now, post-war, when the economy of bonsai really started to amp up, he became a little bit more wealthy, but by this time, his life was at a close. So he really became famous after his death. And he utilized a lot of Chinese elements in his pots, like the Cantonese glaze, the non-bond shape, and other just shapes of the pots. He's highly sought after. His pots could be extraordinarily expensive, but they're usable and easy to match with trees. And he died in 1970. So here's an example of a really small one. This is a mame with a greenish blue glaze and some added bits in there. His variability in his glazes was quite amazing and very difficult to reproduce, if not impossible. Here's another greenish blue. Here's another green. He really liked greenish blue glazes, as you could see. And now this is not a Tofukuji pot. This is a Cantonese pot. And you could see the similarity in the glaze type. Of course, it's modified and changed a bit, but you could definitely see where he got some inspiration. This one's actually not an antique, but it's a good representation of that type of glaze. Here's a non-bond that he made. So there's that non-bond shape. Okay, moving on. High-end Kozon, another famous artist from Kyoto, was born in 1905. He learned from his father, who was also a ceramicist. His family was a multi-generational ceramic family. And he liked incorporating aesthetics and practicality of use and really enjoyed building bonsai pots. Before the war, he used this whitish clay and those are treasured. Very much more expensive than his post-war works. When he went off, so he did fight in the military, but while he did so, he did a lot of research in clay, and he still kind of tried to incorporate his passion for ceramics. And after the war, he restarted his kiln. But still, before the war is kind of where his pots are most beloved. Now, he was known as the razor, which is kind of cool, because of the sharpness and of the lines in his pots and the precision in the construction of his pots. So he was kind of almost like robotic in the creation of his pots, but it's something that he's well known for. So here's a post-war pot from Yoruzen, nice blue glaze. And here's a pre-war. You could see there's much more patina on there, but you still see those sharp, nicely cut lines. And there is that characteristic whitish color clay. So that's usually a key indicator for the pre-war pots. Not all of them, but for most of them. And then there's his one of his many chops, but that's a pretty normal one to see. Okay, so that's the end. Now you have a little glimpse into the world of pre-World War II bonsai pottery. And hopefully now when you look at pots, you could kind of view them through a different lens and be like, oh yeah, maybe that's an antique shape, or I wonder where those, or maybe now you know the cloud feet are definitely an antique kind of thing. And maybe that will open some doors to new questions and new ideas. And this could be a continuing conversation amongst the whole bonsai community. So this is just really an introduction. And please shoot me some questions if you have any. And follow me on Instagram, KIBonsaiArt. I also have a website, kibonsaiart.com. And I'm on Facebook, so feel free to message me through any of those means. And I will see you soon. Thank you. So now we're going to take a look at the pots a little bit more close up. I'm going to give you a view of it from all different angles. So the darker spots on these pots, that is what's called, that's an accumulation of patina. Now we're going to look on the bottom where you could see a heavy accumulation. So that's just after decades of use. You have the buildup of dirt, dust, fertilizers, all sorts of things that just kind of pile on and build. And it's actually considered something quite beautiful, especially when you're growing bonsai trees and you want them to look old, and you want them to be in these old little houses. So you'll actually even have people in Japan who rent out antiques just for a show, and after that they're done just because they're trying to get that old pot with the old tree. So this was the Nanjing porcelain ware. You could see aka the white gold. This is another antique Chinese kind of whitish clay. Kiln, which is the sky blue glaze. And you can see it has that kind of crackle and different hues of blue, especially on the lip. There's this dark accumulation of the blue. It's really pretty, nice for flowering trees, especially if you could contrast the blue with like a red or a white. So pretty nice. Okay, so now this one's not an antique, but I like using it as an example of Cantonese glaze. It's an old pot, but not an antique. So this is that very characteristic greenish blue glaze that often is high in copper. And actually there is some patina on here. This is the one kind of glaze that Tofukuji would be trying to replicate and kind of have his own flair on. You have that Real nice wide lip on there. Large drainage hole. Okay, let me put that one off, a little heavy. Here's a Japanese pot, pre-war, World War II. This would be made by Ichiyo. As you can see, I have a bias towards greenish blue glazes. I think that when you look at trees and their leaves, you see blue and you see green, and so that's why it matches in my eyes very well with most trees, just in terms of a color standpoint. And here are the kiln chop on there. So there's many different types of kiln chops, which can make it very confusing. But it's a useful tool to have when I'm doing artists in different kilns. Here's an antique Chinese. If you can, you really should feel these in person if you're interested in antique pots, because that's one of the best ways to learn about them, is just to handle them. So if you can meet up with a professional in your area or someone who collects and ask if you could handle them, it really is educational. Just feeling comparing a tokoname or a modern Chinese pot to an old one, it can be kind of mind-blowing because they do feel very different. And even just looking at them close up, you could see the two kiln chops on here. Actually, two different. This was probably a collaborative piece. Two different kilns that came together. Very nice. So this would be just an old Japanese pot. Don't know the maker. There's no kiln chop on there, and it's not similar enough to any style, to any artist to really be able to ID it. But it is old. There's a solid amount of patina on here. Nice glaze as well. Dark green, once again, I like the greens. Yeah, very powerful pot. It's another thing. So this is an example of a kind of cheap, modern Chinese pot. They almost feel kind of airy. They sound different, they feel different. They get the job done, but when you have a really nice tree, you should consider investing in doesn't have to be an antique, but a nicer pot. And not only are you going to appreciate the tree more because of the container it's in is going to be a little bit more proper, but it just enhances the overall look. So this is a cheapo one, probably $30 to $20 worth. Okay, so just one last. So this is a kyoyaki. So this would be yaki meaning ware, and this would be from Kyoto. Kind of see a little rust stain in there, and nice pot, very masculine. There are masculine and feminine features on pots. This is very blocky. Usually blocky angular shapes are considered masculine. The curvaceous, nice and curvy, round shapes are feminine. So depending on what you have, you may want to pick certain types of shapes or sizes of pots. Okay, that's all we have to look at today. Thank you.